If you wouldn't mind stating your name,
My name is Billy Yates.
do we have your permission to record an interview with you?
Absolutely.
All righty, thank you very much. My name's Carter. It's good to meet you.
Great to
I'm,
meet you.
I was in a group with Nicole Jaley in Austin. To start out, I thought I'd ask some questions about how George Jones might have inspired you. Do you know when you started listening to George Jones? And if he was one of your main inspirations at a young age to be a songwriter?
He really was. So I grew up in a family, a very musical family in Southeast Missouri. My mom and dad both sang, and we had a Sunday morning radio show. And we had, back then, not to totally make myself sound like really old, but it was very rural where we grew up, and there was music was just such a big part of our life. And I remember we had an old record player that was very, important in our house, and we had a bunch of records. So what happened? My mom and dad's house had burned before I was born, and they'd been dealing with the radio station doing a radio show. And the radio station gave them a bunch of old records, and those records happened to be, of course, it was the things that they loved, but it was Buck Owens, it was Carl Smith, it was Jim Reeves, it was George Jones, and some of my earliest memories of music was those old records playing, in the background. And George was always just to me such a stylist and had such a unique, his up tempo songs. They were very animated vocals. That I think for a child or whatever, for me, it was like, it was like he was almost a cartoon character in the way he, all the ups and all this, the way he sang, it just really got my attention. So he was always like, from the time I was really small on up. I mean, I just always adored George. I later met George for the first time. I was in high school, and I was doing a lot of artwork, and I have a whole collection of like drawings that I've done of different, mostly movie stars, and got autographs on those, and went to a concert, a George Jones concert, and got up the nerve to walk up to the bus and ask him to sign my drawing, and he did. And I remember being really scared and whatever. And it's just when I think back, to what, how important he was to me, and then how where it wound up, the friendship and all the things, the songs he recorded and all that stuff. It seems a little, it's crazy, because in my mind I still can go back to when I was sitting. I can still see that old record player, and I can still see us sitting around listening to George Jones singing "Old Brush Arbors by the Side of the Road," songs like that, old ones.
Yeah. Did you have a favorite song at the time?
There was actually a gospel. So I'll back up a bit, and again, our radio show was we were doing gospel music, and so a lot of the stuff was on that, and it was like at the time it was like "Old Brush Arbors by the Side of the Road, where a sinner could lay down his heavy load." And it was just like those were the songs, that I remember the most, or the earliest, that made the earliest impression on me. And then, of course, later I got into all the White Lightning, and you know, and all the great songs, all the stuff in this, like in the '60s, and all that. I don't know, just it's all. I have so many George Jones favorites, so hard to pick one.
It is tough. So you mentioned having the musical family. We found that, did you have an uncle who was also a songwriter?
I did, and so interesting you bring that up. So that's pretty sharp. So my mom, one of her older brothers, his name was Ervil Collins. Ervil just died a couple of years ago. He was in his 90s, and he wrote a lot of songs for like the Wilburn Brothers, and for different ones. But he wrote "God's Gonna Get You for That." God's gonna get you for that. And he was the one that really kind of, for me, it was like, again, growing up in a small town, it's hard to know how to dream big enough to step outside of that little circle, in that little bubble. And he was the one, I think, for me, that he left, came to Nashville when he was a young guy, and had a lot of songs recorded, and it made it, if he could do it, I thought, well, if he could come from this part of the country and little small town and go do it, I could do it too. And so, when you're young and you're fearless, and you just do it. But it was a huge inspiration. And writing songs was, for me, was something that came kind of later too. After I moved to Nashville, I think I was intimidated by his success that in that regard. So I think I was reluctant to get into songwriting, because I came to Nashville to be a singer. And it took me a while to kind of get into songwriting, but he was a huge influence. Ervil Collins, like I think he was called Eddie Collins or Ed Collins, but his real name was Ervil. I
Yeah,
called him
well,
Uncle Ed.
I'm sorry to hear about his passing.
He was 97 or something. I mean, he lived a long life. So
That's good. So you'd say that was like one of the major factors of your commitment to becoming a songwriter
I
and
think so, and I think just both sides of the family were very musical, and so it was just kind of a given that that's what I was going to do in my mind. It's like I always loved singing and I love music so much, and so I think the fact that he did what he did made it. I felt like I could do it.
once you and George started to become friends, did you get to spend a whole lot of time together or just kind of here and there? And how was that?
It's funny because it started out when I got to Nashville. Of course, I had to survive somehow, and I had my dad was a barber for 40 years, and I went to college for about 2 weeks. But I was really wanting to do music, and so he's like, "Get a license if you're not going to stick with college, get a license." So I got a license. I cut hair for 10 years, so 5 years in Nashville on Music Row, and one of my first clients was Nancy Jones, and Nancy would come in and get her hair cut, and then it got to the point where she's like, "Come out to the house," and I did that. I got to the house, and then of course, I'd be around George, and George, she would come into the shop where I worked. I just had my own little room there on 17th Avenue, and he'd come in and sit with her or whatever. He was kind of quiet, and I, but of course I was, in awe and trying to hide it and trying to be cool. And but I got to the house and he'd be there. And I'll never forget, one of the funniest things that ever happened was Nancy called me one day and she said, "Billy," I've got George talked into letting you cut his hair. And I was like, "Really?" It's like, "Yeah." And so she said, "So can you come out now?" I was like, "Yeah, I'll come out." So I went out. He comes out of the bathroom and he's just washed his hair. He's just got out of the shower. His hair's like everywhere. He's got a robe on, and he comes over and he sits down in this chair. She had kind of a beauty shop of sorts set up there and off the bathroom. And so he sits down, and I he's like, "Hey, George," it's like, and we've not really connected at all at this point. So this is just like very early, being around George. And so it's like, start combing his hair and say, "How you doing?" It's like, "He's fine." He's kind of quiet. I start sectioning it off and I pick up the shears because I'm going to cut it. I mean, she called me to come in and cut it. Well, no offense to George, but and he can't defend himself now, but it was like a bowl cut. So he like everything was like one length right down here. So I've already talked to her about it. So we're just going to cut some layers into it. We're just going to loosen it up and whatever. And so I get the shears out and get ready to cut. And he goes, "Now, what are those for?" And I said, "Well, George, I'm just going to kind of loosen it up, just cut some layers and just kind of take some of the weight off of it, just talking, just trying to," he goes into a rant. He's like, "Gee, so it just goes nuts." So it's like, no, I was like, "No, it's okay. It's okay." So look, I'll just style it. So I just, kind of like blow dried it, kind of loosened it up. Anyway, one of the funniest things, because after we got to know each other, after we got to be friends, there were a lot of laughs over that whole incident. But, after, not long after that, this would have been around 92 when, I was finally kind of coerced into writing songs. And my very first writing appointment was with a guy named Bruce Boughton. And Bruce, is a great steel guitar player, but also a great songwriter. And so I was singing a lot of song demos for all the different songwriters. And so Bruce convinced me to try to write a song. And so he called the night before and he said, "Would you be okay if Frank Dykes came in and wrote with us?" And I'm like, "Bring everybody you got." It's like, I am clueless. I don't have to write a letter at home, much less a song. So it's like, I'm thinking this is going to be a disaster and I'm going to embarrass myself. And so I meet Dykes the first time there. And Dykes is this old songwriter who had written a lot of great songs. He's a great lyric writer. If I had anything in me at that point, it was a melody. So I know this is kind of a long story, but it's very important because the very first song I wrote was that song that day. And Bruce Boughton came with an idea called "Walls Can Fall Down." Dykes, and I'm just sitting there, kind of clueless. holding the guitar. And Dyka said, no. He said, your idea is Walls Can Fall. It's a George Jones song. And he grabs his yellow notepad. He's like, writing all this stuff out. And he hands it to me. He said, you got a George Jones melody in you. And I'm thinking, my God, that's probably all I got. That's probably all I've got. If I've got anything, I've got a George Jones melody because I've grown up listening to George all my life. And so I look at his lyrics and this whole melody just kind of falls out and start playing, and I think, just being a singer or whatever, there was a certain, just a natural instinct you had a natural instinct for phrasing and that kind of thing. Anyway, it just fell out, it's like, that's it, so we got a little, tape recorder, he hits it, we record it. So he says, come out to the house and write with me tomorrow. And so we started writing songs. He would get up at like 4:00 in the morning and write lyrics. And I'd put some melodies to some of those, and I'd pick one or two or whatever, and we'd write some melodies to them. And probably within the first 10 songs came a song called I Don't Need Your Rocking Chair. So we wrote the song, Carrie Kurt Phillips. Carrie came out, and the three of us wrote that song together. And then I took it in, turned it in. I had started writing at a publishing company, even though it wasn't a songwriter. They had signed me because they were trying to get me a record deal. So I was writing at a company called Hori Pro. Bob Beckham, who's a legendary publisher who's now gone, took a chance, and I turned that song in. They sent it to MCA. Long story short, George does it. So I go out to listen to a great story around that too. I was actually in the studio when they did it. I snuck in I sneak in places. I snuck in the studio where they did it. I could tell that story if you want to hear it after a while. But anyway, back to the point. So I go back out to the house to listen to the song, and I had this other cassette tape. Everything was cassettes back then. And I sit in the car with George in the basement. And so this is really kind of one of our early times to really be like around him and really kind of on a more, just more one-on-one. Sitting in his car in the basement, played the song, Rocking Chairs, like loved it. I said, are you finished recording? He said, we're pretty much done. He said, I've got a few overdubs to do. He said, you got another song you want me to hear? And I said, well, yeah, I got this other song. Well, it was this first song I'd written with Bruce and Dykus. I put it in, play it for him. He said, I really like that. Well, guess what? It became the title cut of that album. It had Rocking Chair on it. So that was just, the beginning. So Walls Can Fall was the title of the album. It was also a single. It was actually a pretty cool video with it. And so that was just the beginning. And for whatever reason, George and I started just hitting it off. And a lot of it was, we had similar upbringings, I think. And I think we had a lot of the same kind of religious and views. And we were able to share that stuff. And so, for me, it was pretty awesome to be able to get into those conversations with my hero.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. That's a really great combination. Did you ever find yourself getting to write with those guys again? Sounds like you were somewhat of a dream team.
We wrote a lot of, with Dykus. Now, Dykus is gone now, but I think we wrote over 200 songs. I think if I'm not mistaken, I've written over 3,000 now. And Dykus, we wrote a lot of songs together. And Odie, I know Odie, you knew Dykus, and you're just a character, and you learn so much from those guys. And I never really, during all that time, it's like I never considered myself a songwriter. I just got in the room with great writers and contributed what I could. It took years for me to ever get to the point where I really could seriously look someone in the eye and say, I'm a songwriter.
Billy, would you share that story about sneaking in the studio?
Yeah. Oh. So George is supposed to do this song, Rocking Chair. And so he called and said, yeah, we're going to do that song on Wednesday. So he actually called me. And so that knocked my socks off to, get a phone call from George Jones. He said, we're going to do it on Wednesday. And so I found out where they were recording. And so I circled the studio all day. I drive around. And so at some point I see him standing in the parking lot, smoking a cigarette. He's there smoking. So I pulled up beside him, probably scared him to death. I mean, the last time he saw me, I was trying to cut his hair. So I'm that guy, So, roll the window down, kind of introduced myself. And I said, wrote the song, this Rocking Chair song. And yeah. He said, we're going to do it tonight about 6:00. I said, man, I would give anything to be there, So I'm dropping the hint thinking, he's going to say, well, come on by, He don't say a word, he just like, smoking, nothing. And so it's like, okay, well, good luck, hope it turns out good. Oh yeah. I drive off, but he'd made the mistake of saying, at 6 o'clock, they're going to do that song. So guess where I was at 6 o'clock? I go back over to the studio, and I'm just kind of lurking around in the parking lot, just kind of, waiting, thinking, I checked the door was locked. And so at some point, Stuart Duncan was a fiddle player that was playing on that session. And he comes walking out the back door, and I grabbed the door and walked in like I owned it. And I walked in and I realized very quickly that I'm in a place I'm not supposed to be. And I wound up in the actual studio, and the band is in there at that. They're actually tracking a song. So it's like, I know I'm not supposed to be there. And I see a door to my left. And so I walk into that door, and it's the control room. Emory Gordy Jr. is producing the record, and he's in there playing bass on this song at the time. And so he don't see me. Nobody really pays attention. Everybody's very caught up in what they're doing. And so I see a chair in the corner of the room. And so I just go over and get behind the chair in the corner. So I'm like scrunched down behind a chair in the corner of the room. And I'm crapping my pants, basically, because I'm not supposed to be there. I think I'm going to mess this whole thing up, right? And this is like, the thing I've dreamed of all my life, and I'm probably going to mess it up. But it might be worth it. I might get to actually see this happen. So anyway, they come in, they finish the song that they're doing. They come in the control room, they listen to the playback. Nobody saw me except for George Jones. So they all come walking through the room, and I'm literally hiding behind this chair, and I can peek, I can see from, between the things in the chair. And so they all come walking in. George is last one in the room, and he comes in and he glances around and he sees me, and he never said a word, but we made eye contact. I thought, okay, so he just goes on about his business. They listen to the song. They get done with that song. Emory, the producer, said, George, let's do it. Let's get one more song. Let's go do that rocking chair song. And I promise you, he glanced at me and he said, no, I'm getting a little bit hungry. I think we should call it a night. I'm just like, oh my gosh. I've like totally messed this whole thing up. And so Emory, the producer again, he's like, actually is Patty Levis's husband. Emory said, George, we got the band here. We got time. Let's go and try to get that thing. But of course they did it. And so it was just amazing to kind of be a fly on the wall, because it really was. I told Emory later, I was playing the Opry, and Patty was on, and he was out there with her. And I said, Emory, I'm going to tell you a story that I'm sure you have no idea, anything about. And I told him that story, and he said, if I'd had any idea, he started laughing. Of course, that was hilarious. He said, if I had any idea, he said, I would have asked you, Lisa. I'd never liked songwriters in on those sessions. He said, because, just can muddy the water.
You mentioned it was so special for you to be there when he was recording on his album, but you got to have him on one of your albums, Choices. Is that correct?
We did a duet on Choices. Prior to that, I was doing I was on Columbia Records for about 3 years, and nothing really happened with that. But I actually did a couple of what I think are great records with a great producer, Garth Fundis. I learned so much from Garth. But anyway, we did a record for Columbia, and we recorded. The first time I was in the studio with George doing something together, a collaboration, was on that project, and that never came out. It's still out there, and it's a great record. We did an old Don Williams song called No Use Running, and George came in and sang on that with me on that. So that was the first time. Then and that was probably around 2000, and I asked out of that deal, and I started my own label, because I was just ready to do my own thing. And I asked out of my deal at Columbia, and did. The next day I started recording a new record. Actually, I started a label. My label is called MOD Record Label, my own damn record label, because I've been through all these different record deals and had just felt like, it's like, I'm giving you everything I got and nothing's good enough, And so just time for me to do my own thing. And so one of the, I don't remember, I've done about, I think it's about 11 or 12 records on that label. But anyway, one of those, we decided to do a cut of Choices, and I called George. He said, yeah, he said, we'd love to do it. And so we took the studio down to his house and we recorded down there. And it was so funny, because he's like, well, I had no idea you could record in your house. He said, I'll never go to the studio again. It's like, he just thought it was the greatest thing that you would just come and set up and do it there. And it was like, could we build something in this corner? He's like, he was just all about it. It was a lot of fun. There were so many times, that being one, but there were a lot of times just going down, and he would call and just say, what are you doing? I was like, well, I'm, weeding the garden or whatever. He's like, well, coming down, it's like I go down and we would just hang out. And he was just the neatest guy. And I would forget a lot of times. We got to the point where I'd forget he was George Jones. He was like my grandpa. And it was just an awesome relationship. And then in the middle of all that, then you realize, like, my mom would go back to those old records and whatever. It's like, this is George Jones. It's crazy.
So it sounds like you spent a decent amount of time at his house. Didn't you get married there?
Got married there, yeah. So we were, my wife and I were going to get married. We had plans to get married, and so I was talking to Nancy Jones, and Nancy, my wife's name is Nancy, and so she's like, when are you gonna get married? And I said, well, we had a little house in Ashland City. And I said, we're just gonna get married there in the yard, whatever. It's like, it's no big deal. We have any money. It's like, so we can't do anything too big. And she's like, no, you've got to get married at our house. And so anyway, long story, we talked about, I was like, yeah, you can't pass that up. You got to do it, and so we did. And it was so cool because, my mom and dad and Nancy, my wife's dad, stepmom, and it was a very small. Dykus, my co-writing buddy, was my best man. So it was just a handful of us that went down there and to get married in their house. They were going to be gone. I said, well, Madeline, the housekeeper, will be there, and y'all can just do your thing. We're not going to be home. Well, they surprised us, and they were there. And during our little ceremony, they left the room and just let us have the house to ourselves. And then as soon as it was over, but they surprised, they had a photographer there. They had a whole table set up with gifts. I mean, it was just in a cake. And it's like, we weren't going to do any of that. We were just going to show up, get married, and leave. We didn't want to intrude. One of the funniest things that happened during that time, I don't know if Nancy Jones knows this or not, but she'd get a kick out of it now. But so my mom and dad, we lost them a couple of years ago, both of them. And that's been really tough. I had so many great memories. And this is one of my favorite ones. So when we were getting married, so here we are at George and Nancy's house. We surprise them. We get a limo. So the only money we spent on the wedding was getting a limo to drive them basically to the wedding, and we surprised them. They didn't know where we were going to get married. So they show up there. It's like, oh my gosh, and so they're there. George and Nancy show up. They're there, when we get there. And so they, at some point after we got married, my mom and dad and Nancy's dad and stepmom, all were, my wife, Nancy, so we looked at them, they're gone. It's like, where are they? It's like, did they go outside or whatever? No, they had gone into George's closet and they were looking at office suits, and they were just like, they were getting pictures on the bed. And they were like, it's like, no, you can't do this. You have to get out, Oh man, it's just, so funny. But I'll never forget too, George coming out. Of course, I had a guitar there. I sang to my wife, Nancy, when we got married, and I surprised her with that. But anyway, so my guitar is there. And so George brings out his guitar. And so we leave, we're going on our honeymoon. We're going to be gone. We're heading out. And they're all still there. My mom and dad, they're all still there. Well, they've got the guitar. Well, they're just singing all these old songs and whatever. And another funny thing was, my dad would wear these jeans, and they're just old man jeans, but they were like Braxton was the brand. And so George's like, I like those jeans. Like, where do you get those jeans? We'll be buying. It's like a little store up there, He started wearing it. So my mom and dad, so my mom would hem his jeans. George was not a real tall guy, and so they couldn't get his length right. So they got that figured out. So she would hem him. They would send him jeans. And there's these Braxton old man jeans. Sorry, George.
You're a Missouri native, right?
Did
you ever get a chance to go to the Missouri State Fair the year that George performed?
Not the year he performed. I performed State Fair. I know at least once, but not when George performed. One of the funniest, we didn't see a lot of George shows. Talk about George shows. George is playing. Now, this is before I got to know him. He's playing out at the Opryland theme park. Actually, it would have been before I got to know him. I saw a lot of funny things, after the fact. We went to a lot of shows, but we'd go out there to see him, and George would get so frustrated with the sound and whatever. And so if you went to a George show, a lot of times he would always, if he couldn't hear real well, he would he didn't feel like he was singing great. And so he would apologize to the audience, it's like, well, y'all, so I got a little laryngitis or, whatever. He do that deal. But that day at that show, I could tell he was really frustrated. And so he would he was real nice to the audience. He'd do his songs, and then he would turn and look at the sound guy, the monitor guy. And he would you tell he's shouting at him, and his hair's, Nancy called it back then George. So I feel like I'm being disrespectful, but she called it his helmet sometimes. It's like the helmet with the shape. He's like yelling at the sound guy. And so finally he walks over, you see and we're just sitting in the crowd, in the audience. And so you see this going on between songs. And he's talking to the audience. He walk over at whatever point between songs, and he's like shouting at this guy. He sees like he's up in his face shouting at him. And all of a sudden he rears back and reaches over the console and punches him and knocks him off. The guy goes falling off the stool. The whole crowd gasped. I mean, everybody's like, just couldn't believe what they'd just seen. And the guy gets up, kind of dusts himself off, gets back up there. George comes out and says, well, just but back to the show. It's like nothing ever happened. It's just like, golly. I mean, crazy stuff, funny stuff, it was just George. And everybody loved it. It's like, they knew that he had that side, but it's like, okay, yeah, I probably deserved it. I should have made it sound better. I don't know.
Another side that George might have had, he did a couple songs he wrote himself. Did you ever try to write with him?
We talked about writing. There were, really before his health started failing, got to the point where I knew that wasn't going to happen, but we talked a lot about that. And George did have a desire to do that. Unfortunately, we never made it happen. I would have loved that. It would just been so cool to have written something with George, but that just never happened.
Well, as a songwriting student, and a lot of people who watch this are probably going to be songwriting students. When you were writing for George, being significantly younger than him, what did you learn while working with and writing for an older artist of that caliber?
I think a lot of it, for me, it was a knowledge of, anytime I was writing for anybody, it's like, this or whatever, but it's like when you're trying to write songs, you find yourself kind of channeling the artist. So it didn't matter, like all through the 90s and early 2000s, when I was writing every day, it didn't matter if it was George Jones or it was Brooks and Dunn or George Strait or whoever it was. You sort of channeled what they do, and what they sound like and how they phrase and all that stuff. And I think for George, like when George would get ready to record, I knew that I was going to be able to go down and play him whatever I had. And I knew I had that inside kind of, connection where I could play him whatever. And so, we would write songs specifically for him and just kind of channel what those old records sounded like. He liked really familiar melodies, and then he would change up things and make his, do his phrasing and his thing sometimes. So, writing to me, writing for George was no different than writing for Kenny Chesney or anybody else. The only difference might have been that I think I knew what he liked to say, how he phrased, and I think I had a pretty good handle on that. And that's why I think, he recorded 6 of my songs, and I think that's why, because pretty much from 92 on, every record he did, we get something on there. And it was just because I just kind of usually knew what he wanted to say or how you want to say it.
So I guess just really know your artist and
know your artist. Oh yeah. I mean, I think if you do your homework, and it's especially if you're, no matter who you're writing for, I think if you pay attention to what they put out there that they're looking for, but also surprise them with something better, than something they weren't even thinking about. Try to come up with something that's not been said, or something that's like, or might fit them. I'll give you a great example of, the whole rocking chair thing for George. So Dykus called me. I was actually had been dating my then girlfriend, now wife, Nancy. We'd been dating a year, and I was going to pick her up, go on a date. Dykus called. I was driving to her place. He said, "You need to get out here." He said, I've got a hit idea that we're going to write for George Jones called "I Don't Need Your Rocking Chair." What he didn't know is during my whole time, like cutting Nancy Jones's hair, I knew that George Jones had recorded a song called "Rockin' Years" with Dolly Parton. I also knew that the president of the label said, "No, it's not a hit. We're not going to put it out." George believed it was a smash and wanted to put it out. They said no. I knew through my relationship with Nancy Jones, I knew all this. And I knew that George was so upset when they put Ricky Van Shelton on that record, and it was a big hit, right? And so his record deal, his option was coming up, and he left the label. He'd been at, on Epic Records for years, and he left because of that. So it was a really big deal to him. He really felt like it was a slap in the face. And I think he felt like it's because he was getting older. I think he felt like, there are a lot of reasons that he felt hurt by that, was really hurt by that. So he goes to MCA Records. He's doing a new record for them. And all of a sudden, I've got the chance to write a song called I Don't Need Your Rocking Chair. Think about it. For George to say that was like him saying, I don't need your rocking years. I don't need, it was him. And so, funny thing I'll also note is if you watch the video on that, it's George Foreman and George, in the boxing ring and that whole deal. And there's a spot, and I was there. I got to go there when they did that. I've got a great picture with George Foreman and George and all that. There's a spot in that video, if you watch it, and George said, I want to get this. And he made a big deal. I was like, I want to get this particular shot. And so he just put the camera on me. And so George is standing back in the camera. You watch the video, you'll see this. And so he's got the boxing gloves on. And in the video, he goes, well, maybe I shouldn't share this. Maybe I honestly don't care, because I really don't care. Roy Wunsch was the guy at the label who said, this is not it. We're not going to do this. And George Jones said, this is the Wunsch punch. So there you go.
I've got one more question before I can let the rest of my group squeeze some in. But
sorry, I talk a lot.
So we know that George passed in 2013, and your album Only One George Jones came out about a month later. And knowing that George got to hear the song Only One George Jones, we were curious if you were able to see the look on his face either the first time he heard it or one of the first times.
I was in Ireland. I was doing a lot of shows in Europe and in the UK, and I was in Ireland doing a show, and George had been not doing well. He was in the hospital and not doing well, and I was really worried about him. And I remember I was sitting in Dublin at the hotel waiting to get picked up, and I just like horrible. I was like, something's gonna happen to George before I get home, and I just had this bad feeling. And so I sat there and I wrote that song while I was waiting on my ride, and I got back home and was able to go down and play it for him, because he ended up being okay after that. And so I got to go down and play it for him, and he said, I like that. He said, I want to record that song, and I'd like to bring other artists. I'd like to make it like an event, And so, of course, that didn't happen. And not too long after that, his health started to really decline, and he wasn't able to do that. But yeah, he got excited about that, because he thought that might be like, another shot to, he used to laugh, so in 92, Rockin' Chair came along, and then around 99, Choices came along. And both times he wasn't getting any real airplay on the radio. And so he was all, those were special to him. And so in our conversations, and a lot of fun, he'd be like, I'll bet you're glad I recorded those songs. And I said, I'll bet you're glad I wrote them. Because it's my whole deal was like, well, you couldn't get arrested on the radio until those songs came along. It was my joke with him, and he got a big kick out of that. And I think he thought that Only One George Jones might do that again. I don't know. I don't know. I have no idea.
So, you said he was like a grandfather to you. I think that was so sweet. So I imagine that he had a lot of advice to give, being who he was and with your relationship. So of the advice that he gave you through the years of your friendship, what advice tends to stick with you the most?
I think a lot of our conversations were on a more personal level. A lot of them were. There was a lot of things, just regarding the music business. I think, how George felt about music, where music was headed, where country music was going. It's no secret. He was not pleased with any of that. And I think he felt really left out, and he felt, betrayed by the industry, because, they weren't playing the older artists and that kind of thing. He's pretty outspoken about all that stuff. I can't think of like any direct, Billy, you should do, whatever. I think more by example, and more of what he said out in public was some of the best advice that I think I ever got from him. Just, he'd do an interview or something, like, he meant it. He wasn't playing around. And I think, most of our conversations, and most times that I spent with him, he wasn't telling me, how to write a song, or he wasn't telling me what I should do, with the, I think I know later on, I'd go out and I was doing these shows in Europe and stuff. And when I was out singing his songs, he liked that. He liked us kind of going out and I do the Opry or something, I remember we were doing the Opry one night, and he's sitting on the side of the stage. You're doing some kind of tribute to him or something. And I told the whole story about how I tried to get him to record Choices several times. He always passed on it, said it wasn't for him. And then finally he did it. And it's like, that whole deal. So he would laugh about those things. But, so there was not any just like, it's like, here's something divine that you have to know, more just by example and just some of the things he did. Just like you learn from people like that.
Would you be able to tell us about that story where he passed up on that song a couple times?
Sure. So every time he would do a new record, I would go down and play him some songs, and so I would take different songs down and play him things, and and he knew what he liked and what he didn't like, and so he was pretty easy to play songs for, because just like yes, no, whatever, and if he liked it, he'd fight for it. He'd probably do it if he really liked it, and so. Again, every time he's doing a record, I'd go down and play him songs. And we usually sat in the car. He liked to listen to songs in his car. So we go down and sit and he had a lot of cars. And so, but he liked the stereo in this one maybe today better or whatever. So we go down in the basement. We sit in the garage in one of his cars and listen to songs. And I played him that song, wrote that song in 94 and played it for him shortly after that. Didn't really have him in mind, when we wrote that song. That song was just about, real life, whatever. And I remember the whole discussion of whether to make it first person or not. And of course, the deal was like, well, if it's he did this and he did that and whatever, it might be a little more palatable for more artists or whatever. And so, like, no, if an artist is going to own it, it's going to have more impact. So the artist has to own it. And so, that song, took it over, played it for George. I think it was too first person. It was too like, I can't say that right now. Maybe, I don't know. He said, no, he said, that song's not for me. But he'd listen to the whole thing. Like usually if you played him something and he didn't like it, he'd stop, halfway through. He's like, no, that's not me. And then go on. But he would always listen. He'd listen all the way through. So, another year and a half or so, whatever it is, goes by and he's doing another record. So he's already passed on at that time. I take it back over. I'm thinking, this is George. He's not going to remember hearing it, And so sure enough, I played it for him again. Kind of the same thing went down. He said, he listened to the whole thing, and you could tell he's like, he understood it, and he knew every word and what that meant. He said, no, it's not for me. So another year and a half or whatever it was he's doing another record. And so I go down to play him some songs, and I thought, I'm not going to take that this time. I mean, he's heard it twice. He knows this song. And if he's going to do it, if he's interested, I can mention it maybe or whatever, but I'm not going to take it. And so I took him some other things and played him whatever, and never played him that song again. And a few days after that, he was recording at that time, the Cold Hard Truth album is what he was doing. And that was on Bandit Records. And so Evelyn Shriver was running the label. And so Evelyn called me and she said, Billy, she said, I played George some of your songs. And there's this one song that I played him that he really likes. He's going to record it. He wants to do the song. I was like, really? It's great. It's like, what is it? And she said, Choices. I said, well, that's crazy. So I've played that song for him twice. He's always said it wasn't for him, And she laughed and she said, well, what's funny? She said, when I played it for him, he said, I really like that. I wonder why Billy never played me that song. So I was like, he didn't remember. He's like, it just, but all of a sudden, it's just timing or whatever. But it just, it hit him. It's like, yeah, I can do that now. And I think as he got older, whatever, I think it's easier to kind of own all these things, in your life. And I think that's kind of what it was for him. And I think to hear George say, I've had choices since the day I was born. There were voices that told me right from wrong. If I listened, I wouldn't be here today, living and dying with the choices I made. To hear George Jones say that at that point in his life, it was pretty special. Other thing that a lot of people aren't aware of on the subject of that song is they had done the final mix of that song, and George had gone into the studio to pick up a copy of that. And on his way back, he was listening to it on his stereo, and he was holding the phone up to play it over the phone for somebody. And in the process of doing that, there was also a bottle of vodka involved. That's when he hit the bridge and had the accident. That song was playing. So the story of his life is playing basically hits the bridge. and they have to cut him out of the car. They, all this stuff. And so then the song came out as a single, of course, after that, and they did the best they could with all the vocals that they had left, whatever there was. He couldn't go and sing anymore. I really, I didn't think he would survive that, but he did, but he told me, and I will share this with y'all. He told me, he said, Billy said, he said, I'd gone out in the woods and I prayed. He said, God, just do something, whatever it takes to wake me up. He just said, I feel like I'm lost. And I, and so he said, I think that car wreck was the reason I'm still alive and the reason I'm in a better place, as far as who I am and how I'm living. And so, things just happen for a reason. And I think that song had its place, at the right time. And I'll never forget, at his funeral, when the preacher walked up to the microphone and starts to do the eulogy. It was just like he's first words out of his mouth. He said, I've had choices since the day I was born. There were voices. He recites that whole chorus. It's like, wow, my hero, this guy that I have like adored all my life, who I never as a kid dreamed that I'd ever get to meet, much less have a friendship or write music that would have an impact on his massive career. Had no idea that day they were sitting out there in National City in that little 1,100 square foot house writing a song, that we were writing what would be George's eulogy.
Well, it's no secret that he struggled with addiction throughout the pretty much entirety of his career. Did you know, or have you seen other artists go down similar paths?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I've known a lot of people that, I think being in the music business, the highs and lows and the good news one day, bad news the next day, good news, but the highs and lows can make you manic, and they can really mess you up if you let it. And I've seen a lot of people that, turn to alcohol or to other things to kind of, try to level that out. And so, and I just don't, I think for George too, it's like, I just think he was that's part of what it was. I think, there were certain insecurities, I think, with George, that I saw. I remember after he had the wreck, he was doing a show in Andalusia, Alabama, and Nancy Jones called and said, would you come? Can you come to the show? Can you ride down with us, whatever? I said, no, we'll just drive down. And I remember getting there, and she's like, you will see. I went on the bus, and he's sitting there in his pajamas, just a little man sitting there, and he's wringing his hands, and he's like, his voice is not back yet. He's been through an awful ordeal, and so his voice is real fragile. And he said to me, he said, oh, I'm just so scared. He said, I just can't give them what they deserve, And I remember, just taking his hand and said, George, they came to see you walk on that stage alive. They don't care what you sound like. They want to see you walk out there and be alive. That's all they care about. And you give it your best shot. Just do the best you can. They don't care. You walking out there, they've gotten their money's worth, so don't worry about it. So, but he worried about, as he got older and his voice, maybe wasn't as strong or whatever. And, he worried about that stuff, and it bothered him. He felt like the fans deserved to hear the George from the, 60s and 70s, and he just,
Okay, I kind of have a more lighthearted question now for you.
Got a little...
No, it's good. So we know through this class that George Jones imitated quite a few people when he first started out and started doing music, and one of those people was Lefty Frizzell. And through research, we found that you're a big fan of Lefty as well.
Yeah.
Did you ever find yourself imitating Lefty like he did, or maybe imitating?
Absolutely. I think every singer, imitates their heroes, and through that process, you find your own voice. But I think that George did love Lefty, and he loved. I'll tell you, he was probably more influenced by Roy Acuff than anybody. And it's funny, if you go back and you listen to Roy Acuff records, you'll hear that George Jones. You'll hear it. You'll be, oh yeah, you just know. And he was also a huge fan of Hank Williams Sr. but Lefty was one of his favorites for sure. I know, and I we all have been guilty of trying to sound like somebody, man, Lefty's like, to me, I always loved Merle Haggard, but to me, Merle was just the next. He was like Lefty 0.2 or something. I don't know. It's like just he refined it maybe a little more or something, but a lot of people, I mean, Willie Nelson, everybody, loved Lefty. So just such a stylist, he just had his own thing. It was Keith Whitley.
Now I kind of have a funny question for you. We all know George was very fond of mowing his lawn. What activities do you enjoy in your downtime when you're not being busy as this crazy, awesome producer and singer and all that stuff?
I during COVID, I got my real estate license, and so I'm actually right now. So we still have our place in Nashville. We bought a place in Southeast Missouri where my wife and I both grew up, and we are right now sitting in an awesome office in downtown Branson, Missouri, where I'm opening a new real estate office. And so one of the greatest things, and as you get older too, I'm 60, I just turned 60. And it's like one of the greatest things about doing music, and as you get older, you get to pick and choose what you want to do and what you don't want to do. And, so I'm just having fun. And so my passion right now is houses. I sold a Big River property today. I sold 7 river lots today. And that's just fun. And it's just fun to try to help people find whatever it is they're looking for. It's a new passion for me. And I still do my music. I was talking to Jeannie Seeley, called a couple of days ago, and we're working on an idea. It's like, I still write, and I still, not as much as I did. I'm going Wednesday this week. I'll go to Nashville for the Charlie Pride unveiling of the bronze statue at the Ryman family. So I've produced Charlie Pride. That's another one of my little, side jobs. And so after Charlie passed away, we're doing a whole duet project on Charlie. That's really awesome. And then I'll do that Wednesday, and then I'll be back in Missouri, probably selling some real estate. And then I'll go back I'm doing the George Jones tribute show in Huntsville on the 24th and 25th. I'm actually going to get to be part of about 4 artists that will open the show, the big show, on the 25th. And then 27th, I'm doing the Opry. So feel very blessed. And I'm certainly not bragging, none of that. It's just like, but you think, you think at some point you're just kind of out, you're just not relevant or whatever. I don't worry about none of that. I get a call to do something. If I want to do it, I do it. If I don't, I don't. And it's just, and there's no harm done, and you do everything with love, you do everything with the right, attitude and whatever. It's all good. So
How cool is it that he did this? He said yes.
I said yes. Well, as you could tell, I love telling stories. So, it's like a chance to, share all that stuff. And I think it's important to document a lot of that stuff. I mean, so I think what y'all are doing has such an important, place, hopefully in history or whatever. It's there, it's documented, it's archived somewhere where it matters. And so there's all these stories. When I'm dead, nobody's going to know this stuff. I'm not going to write a book, probably. It's like, so what few little stories I've got, if they have any relevance at all, it's like, here's a chance to put them out there, and that's the way I see it. So I appreciate you guys so much.
Do you have another question, Jaylee? If not, I do.
I have one more.
Ladies first.
Like,
Go ahead. Go ahead. You go ahead.
Well, when we was doing our research, there was a lot of good things that people said about you in your career and about the good things you have done in your career. And one of the things that stuck out is what George said. He said, when asked the question, who's going to fill their shoes, it was before I knew Billy Yates. When it comes to great country singers and great country songwriters, they don't get any better than Billy. I guess you could say the old possum is a Billy Yates fan. Yeah. How does that make you feel?
Yeah, we were.
When you hear that?
I don't, feel unworthy. I'll be honest. It's like, for George to say that or whatever. We were doing I think it had a record deal that there was the Sony deal, was a Columbia deal. And they were looking for quotes to whatever. And so they went to George and then he came back with that. And I remember when he came back with that, I just thinking it's like, that's a pretty big statement. I mean, it's, it could be like, he could have said, well, I think Billy's great, whatever. I don't know. But, the way they did that was really, really nice, what he had to say. I don't know. I don't, I think it's important. I mean, if to have a career in the music business, one, I think if you take yourself too serious or you try to put yourself on a pedestal or you try to, to me, that's just the wrong thing. Share what you got and use your talents to make, put smiles on people's faces and maybe say something that'll have an impact on their life. If you're a songwriter or whatever that is, but don't get too caught up in yourself and people paying compliments like that or whatever. Absolutely. It means the world to me, but all I could say is, thank you, George.
So I don't remember if you mentioned how old you were when you came to Nashville, but kind of what's the timeline between you moving here to pursue a singing career and like the cutting of Nancy and George's hair?
Great question. So right out of high school, I started making trips to Nashville, and that was about a 4.5, 5-hour drive. So I grew up in Southeast Missouri. So it was about five hours, something like that. And I started making trips. And I remember the first time I ever drove on an interstate was, trying to get to Nashville, like coming out of Paducah, Kentucky, driving like in trucks everywhere. And I was freaked out because I grew up in a small town. But I started making a few friends, during that time. So I made trips to just answer your question, shut with all the small talk. 5 years, I made trips. I made the move. So I started making trips in 80, it would have been 82, 87. I moved to Nashville. Nothing happened. I cut hair for 5 years. I was singing a lot of demos. I was making a lot of friends. I got to know a lot of people during that time, but nothing really happened until 92. It was 5 years. Every 5 years, like something would happen. It got to the point where it's like, okay, that 5-year mark is coming up. And so what's it going to be, And so, I mean, to the point that, I know, my first 5 years in Nashville, I mean, I had like a nice guitar, an old Martin guitar. Someone broke into my apartment, cleaned me out. It was just so hard. I was like rolling pennies to go to Crystal's to eat. It's like if I was going to go out and eat, it was awful, but I was the happiest just because I was chasing it. I enjoyed the pursuit of it so much. And I still do. I mean, it's like just chasing something down, trying to make it happen. Same with this real estate thing. It's very similar. And that was always what it was. I would get a record deal. I had, would be on different record labels. My first deal was like a developmental deal at RCA. That didn't work out. It's like, okay, it's like people could tell me no, but I was just going to prove them wrong. And then I went on, I was on Curb Records, did a record there that never came out. It was awful. Trying to get out of that deal, got out of that deal finally. Then I went to Alamo Sounds, which was Garth Fundus. It was a great experience for the most part, until they closed. And we had a song called Flowers. It was like a top 30 record or something like that. And then went to Sony. During that whole time, though, my point is this, is like, walked away from a lot of different things. I don't think I made any enemies because I always walked away. I always asked out of the deal. I don't think I ever got dropped. I was asking out before they dropped me. But I always made sure that, I didn't burn any bridges, just be one of the good guys. So whatever you do and whatever road you're on and whatever it is you choose to do or you're working on, just always try to do the right thing and always try to, don't burn any bridges. It's like, there's no point. It's like, just, people are going to disappoint you. And there were people that stabbed me in the back at record labels. To this day, I know who they are. They don't know I know it. They later made me money. They later went to record some of my songs on big artists and they made me money. If I'd burned that bridge, they struck the match, but I put it out. It's like, I wasn't going to do it and I wasn't going to go there. And so best advice, give you one advice, is just be real and don't, we're all the same, and you're not better than anybody else, and your talent might shine a little brighter. There were a lot of people with a lot more talent than I was and am, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And you just do the best you can do and put the best you got out there for the people, and make it happen if you can. Don't take no for an answer. Never. I just see a lot of people give up too soon. And that whole talking about this kind of timeline, I remember during the first 5 years, I saw Garth Brooks come down and give up and go home. He came back and made it the second time. There were a lot of people that I felt like I knew a lot of people, during my early years in Nashville that I thought had so much talent, and you see it today. It's nothing's changed. Have so much talent, but they give up before they get their break. So it's just a matter of hanging in there. And I was just felt like, even though everybody's telling me no, well, I'm here pursuing what I want to do. I'm gonna go back home and wish I was there. It's all that's gonna happen, So if I can survive here, if I can make enough money to live and eat and have a roof over my head of some sort, it's like I'm gonna stay here. That was just my attitude. Love the people, they'll love you back. That's the best advice I ever got, was watching Ralph Emery talk to Minnie Pearl on Nashville Now. And he said, Minnie, he said, what's your advice to all the aspiring, entertainers out there? She said, just love the people and they'll love you back.
I want to step in and ask a couple of things you made me think of, Billy, that you mentioned that you and George, related to each other's childhood, how you came up. Yeah. Did George ever share with you about his dad and his dad's issues and growing up in the big thicket? I know you also mentioned his insecurities. Anything you can share with us about George and what he had to say about his childhood?
It was tough. I think, most of it's pretty well documented, I think, but George did have a rough childhood. And I think that, I think he sort of turned to alcohol. And I'm not a psychiatrist. I can't really, but I do know how people tick enough to understand that I think the way George was raised created a lot of issues, and it created a lot of insecurities. And I think, it's easy to turn to the bottle. And for him, it was, being Coke, everything else, all kinds of stuff he got into, but, alcohol was I think the bigger issue as far as throughout his life and his career. But I think, he shared enough with you to know that it was his childhood, and a lot of stuff that happened back there that created a lot of issues for him, and a lot of insecurities. And so, if you think about it too, like early on for George, he always had like a duet partner. It's him and, it was Melvin Montgomery up there with him, or it was, Tammy, or it was different ones. Even when he was doing his solo thing, he'd have Ron Gaddis or somebody up there beside him, and I always felt like that was kind of his security blanket. He had someone there, like if I trip and fall, they still got this. I still got this covered. That was his kind of way of doing that. Maybe, I don't know. It's hard to speak for someone, especially. It's hard. I don't like to speak for anyone. Period. It's really hard to speak for someone once they're gone, because they can't really, can't come back with anything. But so I'm not an expert on any of that stuff, but I do know that there were definitely insecurities, and there were a lot of things that, to me make sense. Just, knowing that childhood and kind of knowing that it was not good. It was rough,
You'd mentioned, I knew that he was not happy with the way things are going with country music, or not, shining a light on older artists. And you had mentioned, Lefty and Hank and Roy. Did he ever talk about any other things, like musicians he respected or other influences or any? Did y'all talk music much?
Quite a bit. This sort of, sometimes I don't know what I should say and what I shouldn't say, and I don't think this matters, but I think it plays a big part in how George thought and how he, I remember he was doing a record with Merle. This is later on. This is later in life. He's doing the record with Merle Haggard. I was down there one day, and he said, I just don't understand. He said, I just don't think Merle likes me. I said, are you kidding? It's like, Merle, he loves you. It's like, it's just so obvious that, you all are, just, Oh, I just don't think he likes me. But I really don't think he thought Merle liked him. And it's just so that same kind of insecurity kind of thing. And there may have been things that were said or done or whatever that I don't even know about that made him really. He might have known Merle didn't like. I don't know, but it was just stuff like that. There were little things like that that'd be said. You'd think, well, wow, I want to tell you something else and this is actually kind of cool because another little thing that George told me. I was telling Nancy about this a while back, and she kind of knew. George told me after he was in the hospital, he said, Billy said I was laying there and he said I couldn't really talk to anybody. I couldn't really, and he did have tubes and all kinds of. He was, pretty laid up. I mean, it's like, and he said people aren't going to believe this, and he said they're going to say, well, it's probably the medication or whatever. But he said Jesus walked into my room. He stood in the door and he motioned for me, and he said, I thought, well, this is it. I'm going to get up and go to him, and this is it. And he said, I couldn't move. He said, I tried to get up, I couldn't move. And he said, and he just smiled at me and turned and walked out. He said, I knew I was going to get another chance. This is George's story. This is what he told me. That's powerful. I was like, wow. And so he said, I told Nancy, he said, I want you to call Vestal Goodman. And Vestal Goodman, Happy Goodman family, Vestal Goodman, he said, I'd met her a few times. I didn't really know her. He said, but out of all the Christians I'd met, he said, she was like the most real and the most sincere. He said, I want Vestal Goodman to come pray with me. And so she did. And right after that, he got up and walked out of the hospital. He checked himself out. They had a bus sitting in the parking lot. He got on the bus and went. Like the doctors weren't quite done with him, but he was done with all of it. And he went home. And he was just, so he's George is a very spiritual guy, and I just think that's a side that needs to be told. You know what I'm saying? It's like it's no matter what you think, it's like that's who he was, and that, a lot of that stems back to his upbringing, and it's just all fits together, But he kind of made full circles. Like I think he just got to a point that that's how he wound up, and I think if you're a believer, it's like George, wound up doing the right thing, and he made it.
Did y'all ever talk about his relationship with Billy Sherrill, or are them working together or anything?
No, not a lot. No, we never really. I don't remember a whole lot. I mean, I know he adored Billy, and he because a lot of my musical stuff with him too. And we talked about a lot about the pastor. Whatever, all my stuff is kind of Emery, Gordy forward. So it's Keith Stegall. So producer wise is all that stuff. And so of course Billy, wasn't doing much at that point, but I mean, he used to call Keith Stegall, little Billy. Billy, he kind of credited him being like he thought he was just up there with Billy Sherrill, and Stegall did some great records on George.
What about in the studio? Because before Billy Sherrill, with Pappy Daly, the records were really up to George and the musicians. Pappy Daly wasn't really, a producer,
right?
Did George have much input when you saw what was his role in the studio with Keith or Emery?
He, not as much probably as he would have back then or whatever. He kind of leaned on them to do whatever, he did he did some good stuff too with Buddy Cannon and Nora Wilson. And I remember, going by the studio one day. I'll tell this story too, talk about the kind of studio stuff and whatever. I got Buddy Cannon called me one day to come by the studio, and he had some of my songs he was supposed to do, and I went by, and George was drunk. He was just pretty hammered and kind of fighting mad and whatever. And so they get him out of the studio, and I'd never seen him like that. And so he was a character. I mean, just we all seen we all got friends that get drunk, whatever, something crazy happens or whatever. It's just kind of that kind of thing. And they get him out of the studio, and so they said, they want me to go and sing the scratch vocal while they got their tracks, and they bring George back in after the fact or whatever, But he had a lot of input that day because, I mean, it was like everybody was, freaked out because, he just gone a little too far. But as far as, I think he really trusted the producers and stuff. I think everything I ever saw when I was in the studio I was never in the studio with him with Keith, but I think, and I'm sure he had ideas. I'm sure he threw things out there. Well, what if we do this or what, I'm sure and I'm sure all that was well taken. He was not just going to sit back and, he definitely had his way of singing things. And so when it came to doing vocals, even like on Choices, I'll share this too. It's like, the melody, I had choices today. I was one of those. I wouldn't be here. So the original melody was, I've had choices since the day I was born. There were voices that told me right from wrong. If I'd listened, wouldn't be here today. It wouldn't be here today, living and dying. It was just so he was. It wouldn't be here today, living and dying with the choices I've made. It was George. So he put a lot of his own, style, his own thing into whatever he did. But remember that line didn't go up like that. And so when I would do it live, like writers' nights or my live shows or whatever, I always kind of did it my way. Then after George died, I started doing it his way because I thought, well, got to keep his thing alive, got to keep it going. So I started singing it more like George.
Do you have that demo you could send me or your version of it I could find on the
Oh yeah.
The reason why I was Braddock sent me years ago the demo to He Stopped Loving Her Today.
Wow.
And these guys hadn't done it yet, but to hear the demo and then what George did with it, and I want to do that, which we listen to Choices, but I'm going to
absolutely. And you'll find it's actually out there. So on the record I did with Fundus in '92 on Almo, we recorded that song. That was the first time it was recorded. And then, I'm sorry, 97. That was in 97. So, and then I was out doing shows with Alan Jackson. I really thought that Alan would do that song. Alan always loved that song. And sure enough, finally at the award show, he like broke into it. If you remember when that whole deal, that was pretty awesome too. Another great story. But
that whole story's in the class. We're about to get there, and where he did the Papa Top and then did Choices. And
great. Crazy.
Thank you for taking the time to do this.
Absolutely. Such an honor, y'all. Really, I'm so glad to get to share and just hopefully inspire and wish you all the very best, man. Just so cool.